Hey, I'm Daniel Colburn. I'm one of the creators of an event sourcing package for Laravel called Verbs. I recently had the opportunity to travel to Sydney, Australia and launch Verbs at Laracon Australia. It was a ton of fun. I got to meet a bunch of people who've done event sourcing or are about to do event sourcing, but not in love with the way it feels. Verbs is an attempt to make event sourcing feel really intuitive to Laravel developers. During my talk, I did a little bit of live coding, actually using Verbs to refactor a feature. About 80% of the way through my talk, I ran into a bug, the demo gods struck, and I wasn't confident that I could solve that bug on stage with 300 people watching me and also make for a good talk. This is what that looked like.
Okay, now what? All right, we could fix this, but we're not going to, right? Because we just don't have time. So we're gonna delete this expectation, because that's just, if the test doesn't pass, just delete it, you know? All right, we're gonna take the exact same thing from here. We're gonna copy it over to our application rejected. This is TDD, y'all.
So yeah, rather than forcing 300 people to watch me struggle, I opted to bail on the remaining live coding and just kind of talk my way through the rest of the talk. The talk felt like it was successful. People have said they enjoyed it, but I wanted to make sure that there was an actual copy of the live coding that I had intended to do out there so that people could reference it in the future. So that's what we're doing right now. So let's get into it. All right, so here we are in the code base. So the concept that we were talking about in the talk was a job application situation. So applicants can submit applications. There's a status column on the application that is like submitted or approved or rejected, right? And so we're going to use verbs to handle that. The reason we're going to use verbs here is that over time, we're going to have to refactor the schema of how this is built to comply with sort of changing expectations. And so by doing it with verbs, we're going to be sort of able to change that schema over time. So I can show you what we're doing right now. So I've written 3 tests. So this is the first requirements test. Then there's 2 more requirements tests that are separate sets of requirements that are going to cause us to need to change our schema. The beautiful thing about event sourcing is that between these schema changes, we could basically nuke our whole database, truncate the columns, truncate the rows, delete the tables, regenerate the tables, remigrate the tables, and then replay our events and repopulate the tables with all of the data in the new format. So this is sort of simulating that experience. So right off the bat, we have it creates an application with a submitted status. So we're first expecting there to be no applications. Then we're going to fire a verbs event called application submitted. Then we're going to do verbs commit. This is something that you actually don't have to do in real application code. It gets handled automatically when the application shuts down. We automatically commit at the end. But because this is a test and I want to fire the event and then test what happened after the event was committed, I need to call verbs commit. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and run this test, I guess. And we're going to see, I'll just comment out these other 2. We're going to see, there we go. No query results for models application. And this is happening right here. So we're firing an application submitted, but then we're expecting there to be a single application and we're not finding it. So let's go look at application submitted and see how it works. So this is a verbs event. Sadly, I have to do this in order to explain things in the order that I think is right. This is something you would never have to write in a real application. And we're going to remove this later when we learn about the concept of states. But because I don't want to explain states first, we're going to leave that there. So every event has a handle method. So this is basically an event listener. You can register other event listeners in other places if you'd like. But we think that most events have a single primary effect and that you should register that in the handle method of the event itself. It just makes it a little easier to keep track of what every event does. So in this case, GitHub Copilot is correct. This is exactly what we want to do. So in our handle method of our application submitted event, we're going to create a new application using this ID, and then we're going to set its status to submitted. So I'm going to save that, rerun test, boom, our test passes. We'll go back here. It can approve an application, setting approved status. So if I go back to application submitted and go look in our directory, you'll see in my app events directory, I have already pre-created a couple of events. One of them is application approved. So we're going to go in there. It's going to be very similar. In this case, I don't have to do all that nonsense at the top because we're always passing in an application ID. In this one, we had to spin one up. So in here, we're going to do exactly this, application find this application ID, and then we're going to update the status to approved. Going to need to import application, and we should be able to run it, and now both tests pass. Great news. All right, and then if we go back to our test and uncomment the third thing, it can reject an application, setting the rejected status. So application submitted, we're going to fire one, pass in the application ID, verbs commit, and we're going to expect the status to be rejected. Great. So if I go back to application rejected, it's going to be very similar. Boom. We've got 3 passing tests. Awesome. So this is our first requirements test passing. Now our schema is about to change for our second requirements test, so I'm just going to comment out the first requirements test, go to the second requirements test, and we'll pick it up here. All right, so jumping right into the second requirements test, I'm going to go ahead and uncomment everything, and then I will recomment everything except for the first test. So what are we doing here? It creates an application with no timestamps. Right. So at this point, what we're doing is, if we go look at our applications table, right? There's a status column. There's also an approved at and rejected at, right? So in our first implementation was a very naive implementation where we just had a status that could be like submitted, approved, or rejected, right? Now we are, requirements have changed. We now need to know when they were approved or when they were rejected so that we can sort them in a table or something. So we're actually going to get rid of our status column, and we're just going to add an approved at and rejected at timestamp, right? And if there's no timestamp set, then we can assume that they are just submitted. We've all built applications like this where you start with a status column, then you realize, oh, I need a little bit more data. I need to know when something happened or when the status transitioned, or I need to know a combination of different things that happened to derive the status. So this is sort of the story we're talking about. So we're going to go right back to our requirements test. We're going to run it. And what are we going to see? We're going to see application has no column status, right? So in our application submitted, we're setting our status to submitted. So instead of doing that, we're going to set our approved, we're just literally going to set nothing, right? Because this is just when it's submitted, so there are no timestamps. So if I rerun this, great, it just passes. So nothing happens on submitted. So then we're going to go to here, let's go back to our test. Let's uncomment this second method. We're going to see it can approve an application setting approved at. Great. So we're going to do exactly the same. So we're going to go to application approved, and we're going to fire it. So we're going to find the application. Right now we're setting status to approved. Instead of doing that, we're going to set approved at to now. Great, now we've got 2 passing tests. Then, surprise, surprise, we're going to do exactly the same thing for rejected. So we'll do that. And we've got 3 passing tests. All right, and for the next one, all right, so for this one, we're actually adding a new a new expectation. So in addition to setting timestamps, we're now going to say we can't approve an application which is already approved or rejected. And then similarly, we can't reject an application which is already approved or rejected, right? So if something's already approved, it can't be approved again. If it's already rejected, it can't be rejected again. And then if it's already approved, it can't be rejected. If it's already rejected, it can't be approved. So we can basically only go from no timestamps to one timestamp. We should never be in a situation where both timestamps are set. So that is basically what we're testing. So I'll comment this last one out just so that we can test the first one. In my live coding, I ran into a bug here. So this is something that we haven't seen. So we run into it, we see that there's an exception not being thrown. So we're expecting this exception to be thrown right here, and yet it is not. So first let's focus just on this first exception. So we're going to go right here into application approved, and we're going to introduce a new concept called states. So in verbs, a state is basically just an object, very similar to a DTO. It's just a PHP object that has some properties on it. And those properties are going to be mutated over time by events happening. So I'm going to give you an example here. So for our application, let's create something called an application state. So let's go back to our application submitted event. Remember, I told you that this whole thing was a mess and that it was not something you would ever have to write in real life. We only wrote it because I didn't want to explain states right off the bat. So let's just make this much more normal. A public nullable integer called application ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell verbs using an attribute that this is a state ID and that it is the state ID of an application state. Okay, now that class doesn't exist yet, so we're going to use an artisan command. Art is my shortcut for artisan. We're going to say art verbs state application state. All right, so we created an application state. All of our new things in verbs come with a Lil Wayne lyric. All right, and we're going to add a public carbon sure submitted at. That's great. And then we'll add public carbon approved at, public carbon rejected at, right? So we don't really need a submitted at. We only need approved at and rejected at. So we'll get rid of that. So basically all we're doing here in our application approved is saying that this event applies to an application state. But this particular event isn't going to mutate the state. What is going to mutate the state is an application approved event, right? So in this case, we're going to do exactly the same thing we just did. We're going to take this attribute. We're going to apply it to our application ID. Import that. Import that. And then we're also going to add a public function apply. And our apply method is going to apply specifically to an application state, right? And so this is going to be a method that when this event is fired, it will mutate that state. And we're going to mutate it in exactly this way. So we're going to say set the states approved at to now. So if we do that, then we can go back here to our test. And when we fire, here, I'm just going to comment all this stuff out. When we fire application approved for the first time, let's just call this like event, right? We can go ahead and get that state, event states, or state application state. And let's just DD that, right? So that we can see what that state looks like after an event has been fired. So If we do that, and then import application state, there we go. We're going to get a copy of the application state. And that application state is going to have an approved at set and rejected at will be null. So you can see that when an application approved is fired, we're setting that timestamp on the state. Does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, so now that we've seen how that works, we are going to create, so we've got a good application here, and we've got a bad application. This one's approved, this one's rejected. So we're going to expect that when we try to fire application approved again on good app, which has already been approved, we'll get an exception, cannot approve an approved application. So this seems to indicate that we're going to have some sort of validation of whether or not we can throw, or whether or not we can fire a given event. And that is exactly true. So in the same way that we have an apply method here, we're also going to have a validate method. So our validate method also receives the application state, and it's going to tell us whether or not we are allowed to throw this event. Now, this can just return a Boolean, right? So I could say this approved at is null and rejected at is null. This would work. It wouldn't throw an exception, which is what so this would just prevent it from firing the event at all, but it would sort of stop silently. So instead, we want to basically say if state rejected at cannot approve a rejected application. And then if state approved at cannot approve an already approved application. So now let's go look at what so this is just cannot approve an approved application. So let's use that string. And then this other one is cannot approve a rejected application. Let's just copy that string immediately so that we know that we have exactly the same string, because Copilot autofilled that. All right, we do now have the same string. Do you notice the cut? I just cut out a sneeze. Cut out a sneeze. All right, I was about to sneeze again, but I didn't. All right, so now we've got these two exceptions, and we're going to rerun our test. And what do we see? The exception is not thrown. Which one is not thrown? The second one. So, but the first one is, if I'm not mistaken, right? Why is the first one passing? Right. The second one is not applying to, so application rejected is not applying to the state, and therefore it's not doing all of the mutating of the timestamp that the other one is. So what do we need to do? We need a public function apply. It's going to apply to our application state. It's going to set rejected at to now. So now, if we go back to our second requirements test, this is uncommented and passing. So that's great. So now for our fifth test. For our fifth test, it's very similar. We're just checking that you can't fire a rejected at when it's been approved or rejected. So we're going to, let's just go copy this validate method straight off of our approved onto our rejected. And we're going to say that this is going to be cannot reject a rejected application and cannot reject an approved application. All right, seem good? Let's see. Bing bong, we've got 5 passing tests. So this is our whole second test case passing. So let's just go ahead and take a look through what we're doing here. So we create an application with no timestamps. When we approve an application, we can set approved at. When we reject an application, we can set rejected at. And we can't approve an application which is already approved or rejected. We can't reject an application which is already approved or rejected. So a couple of things have already started to happen here. We have introduced the concept of validation based on past events, right? So now we're saying, based on things that have happened in the past, whether something has been approved or rejected we're going to decide whether another thing can happen. Now, this is a really simple example where we're only doing it based on a single thing, which can be represented by a timestamp. But imagine a world where we had a much more complex set of requirements. Like, if someone has been rejected 3 times in the past, they can't submit, right? That is a totally viable thing to do in event sourcing that's actually quite hard to do just inside of your eloquent models. In addition to that, we changed our schema, right? So we had a schema here that had a status column. We got rid of that status column and we added these timestamps. Now, imagine that we had introduced quite a bit of real production data while we had the status column. And now we're introducing these timestamps. We've got quite a bit of data that has this old schema. So migrating it to the new timestamps is actually quite a pain, right? So first thing we have to do is add the new timestamp columns. Then we would have to write some sort of a job which would migrate the old data to the new timestamp columns. Then we could write a migration that would get rid of the status column, right? With event sourcing, it's actually much easier than that. We can simply truncate our whole database, or truncate rather this whole table, migrate the schema first, and then we can run verbs : replay, and it will replay all of our events, and all of the stuff that happens in the handle method will happen again. So we'll get a new copy of all of that data, but just projected into the new schema that we've done. So that's kind of one of the great promises of event sourcing, is that we can pretty safely refactor our schema as long as our data is actually stored inside of events. All right, I'm going to take a break and sneeze, and then we'll come back for the third test. Alrighty, so we're back for our third and final requirements test, something that totally did not work during our talk. So what do we have here? So before each test, we're going to create 2 users, an HR user and an engineer user. So we're scheduling interviews here, right? So it creates an application and it schedules 2 interviews. So as soon as we create an application, we want to schedule an interview with HR and an interview with engineering. The reason we're using this as an example is that it's pretty complicated in sort of a normal Laravel paradigm to use the creation of models to do other things, especially if those things also do something else. So you'll see right after that, we're going to test that we're notifying interviewers when an interview is scheduled. So the way that this would normally work would be something like this, right? So we'll create application, and then inside of an observer, we will then say create an interview. And then inside of an observer on that, we would say send an email, right? And so that is pretty gnarly, right? We have observers creating other things, which then have observers sending emails. It can just get really indirect and hard to tell what's going on. So instead, we're going to do that work directly on the events. So let me comment this last one back out. Let's run this test and see what happens. All right. So we're asserting that the interviews table has the following attributes. It says the table is empty. So let's go look at our interviews table migration. So it's got an ID for application, an ID for user, and a timestamp scheduled at. So we're expecting it to have the application ID, the user ID, and the scheduled at date. So let's go look at our actual test. So what are we doing here? We're just firing an application submitted, we're committing, and then we're expecting there to be interviews. Great. So let's go right into our application submitted. And as soon as this is happening, in addition to creating an application, we want to create an interview. So we want our application ID to be this application ID. And then we want our interviewer ID to be just a random user from HR. And then we want our scheduled at to be 1 day from now, right? And then in addition to that, we want to create something with engineering. I think it's engineers. Let's go see. User. We have a scope on here. Yeah, engineers, plural. Okay, cool. So we're going to go back here. We're just going to set this to engineers. And we're going to do the exact same thing. So we'll import both of these. It's mad about this about this helper. But I think if we go back to this and run it, we should see that that test is passing. So now we just need to test that we're actually notifying people. And so this is a really good opportunity to talk about replays and the consequences of replays, right? So imagine that you have a bunch of events that are generating all of this data. You change your schema in some way and you want to replay all of those events. Well, that means that everything that happens in the handle method is going to happen a second time, right? So let's go take a look at our application submitted thing. So we're creating an interview right here. So this is probably not ideal. We probably want to do this in its own thing, maybe an interview scheduled event. There we go. So we've got this interview scheduled. It can take an application ID, an interviewer ID, and a scheduled at. So rather than directly inside of here creating these things, we're going to say interview scheduled : fire, and then we're going to say application ID is that, and we'll say interviewer ID is that, and then we'll say scheduled at, it has an underscore for some reason, but whatever, that'll work. Scheduled at is that, right? So we'll fire one of those, and then similarly, we'll fire one of these for the other one, right? So now from our event, we're firing other events. So if you think about what I was saying, right? If we were to replay this event, if you can think about sort of what events exist, right? If our table of events is like application submitted, right? And then we replay our event, there's still just that one event, right? Now, if firing an application submitted creates a second event, an interview scheduled event, if this is a byproduct of this, then replaying this could cause us to accidentally duplicate our interview scheduled event. And we could theoretically, every time we replay, create another copy of this interview scheduled event. That's not good. And in other event sourcing systems, that's something you had to worry about. So you couldn't actually fire events inside of your event handlers, at least without doing a little bit of guarding against that. For now, I'm actually going to use a method that we ship in Verbs called Verbs unless replaying. That just allows us to pass in a closure, and anything that happens inside this closure will not happen while we're replaying. And so that allows us to basically say, none of this stuff that we're doing in here should happen during a replay. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret. Event fire methods don't happen when you're replaying anyway, because we think there's no reason they ever should. But for now, just to be a little bit more explicit and make it clear what's going on, we're just going to show you that unless you're replaying, we're going to do this, which means that on each replay, we're not going to make duplicate copies of these events. Hopefully that makes sense. So now we're going to go to our interview scheduled, and inside of our handler method, we're going to say interview create. We're going to set all of those things right here. And then we also want to notify our interviewers. So we'll say interview scheduled notification send. Is it not? It's not send, is it? It's hang on. It's interviewer. Yeah, there we go. Interviewer is that, and then we'll say interviewer notify. What does it need? Just an application ID. Right, there we go. So now, now we're actually sending a notification to our interviewer when we schedule the interview. Now, we have to think again about replays here, right? So if we were to replay these events, you know, in a world where our interview scheduled event is in our database and we're replaying all of our events, if we did it like this, we would end up resending this notification to a user again. So if we replay this event 6 months down the line, our interviewer is going to receive an email 6 months from now that tells them they have an interview scheduled 6 months ago, right? So this is something, this is again code that we don't want to run if we're replaying. So we're just going to say verbs, unless replaying, import verbs, and then we'll do exactly that, right? And then just to be a little bit optimized, we'll say we're just going to look up our interviewer inside here, so we don't even do that database query if we don't need to. But yeah. All right. So then, sorry, I forgot to run the test. So if I come back to our test here, so now we're asserting that we are sending the notification to this guy and that we're sending the notification to this guy. So we are going to run pest. And we should see that both of those pass. So just to recap what we just did one more time, our application submitted event creates an application, and then unless we're replaying, because we don't want to duplicate our events, we're going to fire an interview scheduled event for each interview. Those interview scheduled events are going to create the interview, and unless we're replaying, they're going to look up the interviewer and then notify that interviewer of their interview, because we don't want to duplicate sending the email if we replay our events again. So back to pest, our third requirements test, we're creating an application submitted, we're committing, and then we're asserting that notifications were sent to both of them. And then up here, we're asserting that those interviews were created. And we pass. So anyway, this has been great. Thank you for bearing with me. Thanks to Michael and Laracon AU for having me out to talk there. I felt really bad that our demo didn't go as planned on stage, so I'm really glad to be able to give you guys a version of the demo here and now. If you're interested in verbs, you can go play with it. So if you go to verbs.thunk.dev, this is our docs page. You know, Verbs is very alpha. The docs are also very alpha, but you know, I think they give you enough explanation of how to get around inside of Verbs. And so I recommend you go check this out. And if you go to verbs.thunk.dev/discord, it will invite you to our Discord channel where we're hanging out and talking about verbs. So anyway, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for everything. And the link to my original talk is in the description of this video. Thanks.